back to our class on roles of identity. We've talked about the parent stage, and today we're going to talk about the next stage, the hero stage of the role of, the hero role, I should say, of identity. And the final stage that we talked about in the parent stage was separation, right? The stage of separating. So now we're going to go, once we separate from the parent stage, we move into the hero stage. So what do we need to talk about, Sarah, about the hero stage?
Boy,
Or the hero role? I keep saying stage, but it's actually the roles of identity, because the five major parts are the five major roles that we have, and then within those roles are the stages of change that we go through. So I have to keep correcting myself because I keep wanting to call them stages, and they're really identities.
I think the hero role is a lot of fun to, especially to look back on, like after you're an adult and realize where you get these like core characteristics that you have that stick with you in adulthood. So the hero stage is where the child, after having, established a conscience after having established those boundaries, that sense of right and wrong, then as they realize that they are not their parent, they begin to search they begin to search for a hero to emulate. In the hero stage, the object of the hero stage is to develop the courage to enforce those boundaries that were learned in the parent stage.
Right, and what's really fascinating about this stage, and we'll get into the stages of change within it here in a minute, but I think one of the things that's especially fascinating is to see what you can see between the parent stage and the hero stage. If you have a weak parent or a weak hero, you can see that in the way people interact, right? Because a weak parent but a strong hero, and I think we talked about this a little bit in the introduction, but a weak parent and a strong hero means you're going to have a lot of courage without a lot of boundaries. So you'll do a lot of crazy things. And when we say crazy things, that could be physically dangerous things, potentially. It could be intellectually crazy things, emotional crazy things, socially crazy things, right? Or spiritually crazy things. And then if you have a weak hero and a strong parent, right? Then you're likely to give in to, because you don't have the courage to stand up for the boundaries that for your own conscience. So you give in to things, and then you feel really guilty, and you really end up beating yourself up a lot. So what we really want is a strong parent, that strong conscience, and a strong hero that gives us the courage to live up to the boundaries and standards that we've set as that our internal parent has set for us.
Right. And I like the idea too that we've discussed about how the courage is kind of shown as energy, like the energy to be able to be decisive, to make decisions, and then to follow through on them.
Right. So think about. So here's the interesting thing. We talked about the parent stage. We went through the parent role of identity, and we went through the stages. And to have a really strong parent, you have to be able to go through all of those stages. You have to be able to mimic. You have to be able to internalize, externalize. You have to be able to set boundaries. You have to be able to validate. You have to have all of those parts to have a strong internal parent. And the hero is much the same way. You have to be able to go through the stages of change within that hero identity in order to have that really strong hero. And if you start to skip stages, then that's when you start getting this really weak internal hero. So let's get into some of these stages, right? So with the parent, you start off with the mimicking stage because you are born to a parent, or a parent is handed to you through adoption or something. And so you don't have to seek out a parent usually. Most people are handed that. But with a hero, that's not the case, right? And so when you separate from that parental role, all of a sudden there's this emptiness and this need to fill that space, and that's when we start searching.
Right.
And we're searching for heroes that can fill that space. And here's the thing you have to remember also about this, is that when you first move from the parent to the hero, it's a process. It's not like I jump from here to here and I jump in stages, right? It's a process. So really, you're going through all of these different stages of change throughout the time that you're in one of the identities. So you're in this hero identity, and you're searching for heroes. And in the beginning, when you're 4 or 5 years old, you're going to find heroes. But eventually, those heroes are going to outlive their usefulness, and you're going to have to search again. Right? Does that make sense?
It does. Like I can remember from my own childhood, my earliest heroes were Disney princesses. It was in particular Aurora and Ariel. I would, like, my mom has pictures of me mimicking them and things. And then they kind of outlived their usefulness, and I moved on to Little House on the Prairie and looking at Laura and Ma in those books. And
Right.
so going back to that searching stage.
Right, and that will happen throughout that whole role of identity. You'll be continuously doing all of these stages. So the first stage is the searching stage, the finding that hero to emulate, right? And that hero can be anything. You know, it's not necessarily a person, even a fictional person. I would say that for my daughter Elizabeth, cheetahs were definitely her early heroes. And she would run around on all fours for weeks at a time without ever standing up on 2 feet, because she was a cheetah, you know. And it's interesting because as she's developed, that has kind of, as the cheetah lost its efficacy, she still stayed with cats, and she's gotten into the Warriors books, which are a series about cats and cat clans, and those have remained heroes of hers, and they still are to this day. That, you know, so it's interesting. We search out heroes, and I would say several of my children, my older children, their early childhood heroes were like Blue from Blue's Clues, or Dora from Dora the Explorer. Well, Dora wasn't so much. They liked the side characters more than Dora. So Genevieve, like Benny, she loved Benny the bull. And in fact, she has a stuffed animal that each of my kids get when we give them on the day that they're born. And she named her bear Benny after the bull, because she loves him so much. So, but that's the thing, is that you're searching, you're finding, and then what are we doing once we find those heroic figures?
We start to mimic them.
The same way we did our parents, right? When we were in the parental role, we just start mimicking. We'll start trying to do what those characters, those people, those animals, those whatever they are, we start doing the things that they would do, right? And as and we're going through a very similar process that we did in the parent stage. What are we hoping to gain as we mimic these characters?
We're hoping to gain validation that we are like those characters.
Right. We want the people around us to accept us. And the very young children, 4 or 5, maybe even 6 years old, almost want to be that characters. And they're not only looking for validation of I can be like this person. They want to be that person. I am, my daughter Elizabeth, she was a cheetah, right? And that's okay. In those early parts of searching, in those early years, you want to be that person, and so you mimic, and you try to get people to accept you as that being, right?
Right.
And then it's interesting because as we start to mimic and be accepted. Now, here's the thing, right? Here's the thing is, as we're trying to gain acceptance, right? We want validation. We want to know that people accept us as this thing, or with these traits. If people aren't validating that, how do I? Well, let's just like this. How do you validate a child who is in the hero stage and is mimicking a cartoon character, say?
Well, I'm kind of thinking of when Barry was about three or four, and he would run really fast, and he had this leather jacket that he would wear, and he would like pump his arms, and that was his Captain America run. And so when he would run like that, I would say, "Oh man, you are." Well, I would tell him, "Yep, you're Captain America. You can run
Right.
really fast like Captain America. You look just like him right now." And he would get a huge kick out of that.
Right. So you validate them by telling them, yeah, you are like this character or this person, and you can even say you are this person because it's okay for kids. They need that validation. They need to feel like, okay, I'm being accepted as this identity that I've taken on, right? And and so interestingly, we want to do this in all five domains of life, right? We've talked about those domains of life physically, right? So you're talking about Barry. He would run
Yeah.
like Captain America. He'd pump his arms the way Captain America
Yeah.
would. He would, right? There's a physical attribute that he's trying to mimic, right? But there's also an intellectual attribute that he wants to be. He wants to be able to think like Captain America thinks, right? He wants to feel the way Captain America feels. He wants to be able to interact with people the way Captain America interacts with people. You know, he wants, and Captain America is just a great example because he has all of the five domains of life within even though he's a fictional character, within his character, because he's got a very strong spiritual component.
Yeah.
A lot of fictional characters you'll miss that spiritual component. Captain America has that, and so you have all five of those that you're trying to mimic them all at the same time. And here's the thing: we can validate. I'd say maybe I validated the physical and the emotional and the social parts. Maybe I didn't validate the intellectual and the spiritual parts. And so then my child has identified physically, emotionally, and socially with Captain America, but they have not necessarily identified intellectually and spiritually with Captain America, because I'm looking for validation in all five domains of life.
Right.
And so it's important that as a parent or as an uncle, an aunt, a school teacher, whatever, that you're being able to validate these children in all five domains. Because again, remember your development. You know, you could have a really powerful physical parent and a really weak physical hero, but you might have the exact opposite intellectually.
Right.
And so you want to, what we're trying to do is have as well-rounded of an individual as we can. And so we want to be able to validate or accept these children in all of those five different domains as they're mimicking these characters. And so after we've mimicked for a while, and this is following the exact same pattern, right, that we did with the parent stage, where do we go from there?
So after they mimic, they begin to internalize.
Right. Inside, they ask themselves, right? Again, remember, internalizing is a way of checking against your own internal parent. So so basically you're saying, okay, so other people are accepting me as Captain America. What about myself? Is Captain America actually fit? All these things that I'm doing now, do they actually fit my internal parent, my conscience?
Right.
And so as we internalize, we start to ask ourselves that question. And we might say yes. And if we say yes, then we actually internalize those behaviors. We internalize the emotional responses. We internalize the social responses, the spiritual response, right? And that becomes then a part of who we are. That's where it's becoming a part of us, is that internalization, right? Now, we might reject it. I might say, actually, this character that I'm trying to be like doesn't really fit with my... now, I can't figure why Captain America wouldn't fit with somebody's internal parent. But maybe he doesn't. No, actually, I'll tell you, it's interesting because I was reading an article a little while ago where somebody was talking about back when Captain America Civil War came out, and there was the Iron Man versus Captain America.
Right.
And in the article, it was interesting because the person says, we're all going to follow Captain America because we love Captain America, but Captain America is wrong. And well, in my opinion, Captain America was right.
Yeah.
But that's the point, is that this person, their internal parent said, government standards, government rules are more important than personal freedoms. And so Iron Man, in their opinion, was in the right, and Captain America was in the wrong. And so they wouldn't be able to internalize that Captain America
Yeah.
because it was against their conscience. Whereas for me, the Captain America's choice, the individual freedom, fits more with my internal parent.
Yeah.
And so I identify more with the Captain America. So that person is like, I identify with Captain America, but I can't internalize him.
Right.
Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, because he doesn't line up with their internal parent.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you can see how you might identify with somebody and then reject them as an internal identity because it doesn't fit with that internal parent. So that's where that internalizing is very, very important, and to understand and recognize what's going on.
Yeah. And I think, this is making me think about my internal heroes. I think I identified with the Disney princesses at first on just basically like maybe a physical and emotional level. I wanted to be pretty like them. And, my mom would say I would throw myself on the bed and cry like them and things like that. But I think what happened then was I discovered Laura in Little House on the Prairie, and that lined up more with my internal parent because I wanted to be resilient. I didn't just want to be a pretty princess. I wanted to be resilient. I wanted to, have these other attributes that Laura more embodied.
Yeah, and that's the thing that you're going to find is as you go through. So you're mimicking these princesses in the beginning, and you're getting some validation for it.
Yeah.
And then you're internalizing it, and you're saying, okay, I want to be pretty like these princesses, and you're identifying and internalizing the aspects of the princesses that you can, but there's parts of it that you're like, oh, maybe that's not quite right. And so then you find this new hero that you're like, hey, wait a minute, this person has some of those same qualities.
Right, being feminine and pretty and things like that.
Right, and so they have these qualities, plus they have this other additional quality that the other one I couldn't internalize because I just didn't want to, I wanted to be resilient. And Aurora, while we love Aurora, she's not particularly resilient in that story. Though I do think in the end she's actually pretty resilient, but I think there's moments where she just kind of becomes depressed and is unable to function. So once you've internalized, you've gone through, you've found the parts of this hero that you can internalize. You say, I really identify with this. These are things that I can be. The next stage, what are you going to do? Where do you go from there?
You begin to externalize. So you put your own spin on that hero's behavior. You kind of tweak it with your personality.
Right, and it's interesting because when we talked about the parent stage, little children will do they'll like almost mimic exactly, but then at the very end they'll twist it a little bit and they'll think they're so funny. They'll laugh and laugh. Usually by the time a child is 6, 7, 8 years old, they're not doing that anymore. Now they're externalizing is what usually you're doing is you're taking multiple heroes, you're combining their attributes and creating your own style out of these myriad of different personalities, and it's no longer funny to you.
Right.
Now it's very serious.
Yeah.
And you really want people to accept this new behavior that it really is not any of these heroes, but it's a conglomeration of those heroes. putting them together to create a new identity that is your own. You're externalizing these groups of hero behaviors into single individual, personal behaviors. And you're looking for acceptance again, right? As you externalize.
Yeah.
So internalizing, you're looking to your own internal parent, and you're saying, does this fit with my own role? And then externalizing, you're saying, okay, I feel like this fits with who I am. Now I want you to accept, you as in everybody around me,
Yeah.
to accept me for this person that I have identified.
Yeah, so it's like through internalization, you're checking it with yourself, and then you externalize it to check it with everybody else.
Right, right. And one of the things you'll notice, a lot of times young children, some of their biggest heroes are going to be their school teachers. So a school teacher starts to do certain things, that child's going to want to mimic that.
Yeah,
If a school teacher tells you something, it's like my wife when she was little, and she came home and said, I don't remember what it was. She said something to her mother though, and her mother was like, "Well, that's not right." And she said, "Mom, my teacher said that, and she knows."
yeah,
You know, because she was no longer trying to mimic her mother, she was trying to mimic now the heroes, and her teacher was one of her heroes. And oftentimes that's how our children will identify with their teachers. So pay attention to what your teachers are teaching and what they're and telling their students, because that's going to have a huge impact on the behaviors, the thought patterns, the emotional responses, social responses, and spiritual responses that your children have.
yeah,
And that's going to be really important. And I the other day, I had somebody who was asking me, she said, well, but I thought that what I do in the home would mitigate anything that happened at school. I said, no, you can't rely on that. You
Yeah.
can minimize negative effects from school, but you cannot totally mitigate them through home, because home is only one piece of that child's life and that child's identity. And that school identity is going to be just as strong and just as powerful. And so what you have to do is you have to pay attention to what's going on in all aspects and all parts of a child's life, and recognize that that child's going to take all of that together and create their own identity. Right? Does that make sense?
yeah,
Okay. So when we externalize, right, and we become validated, people around us, you know, are well, we don't become validated. We externalize. That's that stage of change. It's actually validation is the next stage, right? It's I'm going to externalize this for a while where it's just me making up my own behaviors. But eventually, I want validation
yeah,
that those are acceptable behaviors, right?
right,
And so that's our next stage. So our stages start with, we're going to search, we're going to mimic, we're going to internalize, we're going to externalize, then we're going to validate. And we need, that validation requires external feedback, right?
right,
I need parents, friends, siblings, teachers to tell me that what I'm doing is acceptable. And that's not always in words, right? It's not always like, oh, that's so fun. Yes, you are that. Or yes, you, especially with younger children, that tends to be the case. With
Yeah.
older children, you're not doing that because they're no longer mimicking a single hero. They're externalizing a conglomeration of heroic qualities. And so you no longer can identify a single character in their behavior. And so you can't validate them in the same way. Right? That validation has to come in other ways. So what are some ways that we might validate children once they've kind of moved into this validation stage where they're externalizing all these myriad of different qualities?
Well, I think that, you know, I'm thinking about Araya, and right now probably validating her as a young woman, like, you know, validating her as being nurturing, as being
Right, but how do you do
capable.
that? How
How
do
do
you
you
do
do
that?
that? Well, I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is telling her, like, you did a really good job taking care, babysitting today. You are really capable. You are very good at nurturing your little brothers.
So verbal validation is great, but there's something else that you just said that is a validation to her.
Would that be giving her opportunities
Yes,
to? Yeah.
asking her to babysit.
Okay.
You say, "Would you watch the boys while I'm away?" That's a validation that, oh, mom trusts me
Right.
to take care of this. Or if a young woman is learning how to apply makeup, and to say, "Oh, what would you go put on your makeup?" Then there's a validation there that, hey, I trust you to do this, and then you can and then follow that up with the verbal validation, right?
Yeah.
But oftentimes the validation that a child needs is simply an opportunity to show you that they can. So I might ask my daughter, hey, can you bake a batch of cookies? Well, that's validation to her because she loves to bake.
Yeah.
And so that's about, oh, yeah, I will make some cookies. I want to make cookies because I love to bake, right?
Yeah.
And so giving them opportunities to demonstrate the skills that they are and behaviors that they're demonstrating and asking them to do those things.
And that would be an example of why family home evening is so important. That's that spiritual validation. Like, I'm thinking of my kids actually really love giving the family home evening lessons.
Yeah.
And I can see now that's spiritual validation.
Absolutely. When you can give your children an opportunity to share an aspect of the gospel with the rest of the family, they're like, "Wow, mom trusts me to teach this lesson."
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a total validation of their behavior or their spiritual response to the world, and it's just a fantastic way to manage that. Now, finally, once we validate it, and we've just we can't really go into all the different ways you can validate, but here's the main thing to think about. Validation is a positive experience. It's not a negative. So if you're being negative, you are not validating. In fact, when you're being negative and critical, you are invalidating
Right.
a child's behavior. Now, there may be some behaviors you want to invalidate, and so you may not, want to be positive about those. But validation is a positive experience. We're telling our children, hey, you're really good at this. I like to see you doing this. These are good things. Would you please take care of this? Would you, these are ways that we validate. There's other ways to validate, but just the main thing, and remember, validation is always positive. When you're critical, you are invalidating whatever it is. And you have to be careful with that.
Yeah.
You have to be very careful with that because sometimes our children do things and what they do is not bad, but we're in a bad mood. Say my daughter does go and she just makes cookies and doesn't ask and doesn't clean up after herself.
Right.
And all I do is criticize the fact that she didn't clean up after herself and she didn't ask me if she could make cookies. Well, that's not going to validate her, make her want to make cookies in the future. That's not going to make her feel like, hey, I'm a really good cook. That's just going to make her feel bad and not want to approach that again. So I'm invalidating her even though I'm thinking, wow, these are really good cookies. But
Right.
that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you left a mess and you didn't get permission. And I'm being critical. That's an invalidation of something that maybe I want to nurture in her. I want her to develop this skill of baking. And my negativity and my criticism is invalidating something that I actually want her to do. And so that's just a really important thing that we have to remember. You have to be very, very careful with young children that you are not invalidating them, especially areas that you would like them to develop. So then, our final stage, right? Same as the parent stage, is the separation stage.
Right.
They separate from their childhood heroes, right? Now, what's really neat about this, and then what you have to know is, when a child is in the hero role of identity, they see themselves as a hero. They see themselves as even in the later stages, they still see themselves as a conglomeration of heroic qualities. But when they separate from that. It doesn't mean they don't have those qualities. They still have that courage, and the qualities, those heroic qualities that they've developed in their childhood, in that hero role of identity. They just no longer identify that way.
Right.
Right, and that's really important to remember. It's not like you're giving up the qualities you've developed. You're simply giving up the role, the identity of hero, and you're separating from that identity, right? And the same thing with the parent role. You're still got that internal parent. You've still got that conscience that tells you what's right and wrong, and tells you what are appropriate boundaries, but you no longer identify yourself as that parent.
Right.
And so this, again, as you go through these roles of identity, you want to go through each of these stages of change, and you're going through them in each of the 5 domains of life. And you want and need validation, both internal and external, in order to really solidify in the parent stage, the conscience, and in the hero stage, the courage. Any last thoughts, Sarah, about the hero stage of development before we end
I
our
don't
discussion?
think so.
Okay, so just, I just have a couple more quick thoughts. Just, you can look back at your own childhood and identify your own heroes and your own progression through these heroic things. And you can actually start to identify specific qualities that you developed during this stage, during this role of identity between the ages of about 5 and 10, 12, 14 years old. You can identify these qualities and see that they are there. Interestingly, if for some reason you were unable to develop a strong internal hero and you don't feel like you have that courage in any of those domains of life, it's never too late. You can always go back and do that now. In fact, I've done this with several of my clients where they either didn't have a strong internal hero, or they didn't have a strong internal parent, or they didn't have a strong either one of them, and they needed to go back and redevelop those characteristics and traits that were missing. And within the hero stage of development, sometimes what I'll do is I'll have people go back and identify, okay, what's a hero that you would really like, and then we get it really into it. I had one client who he really loved Batman, and he had a very weak internal hero. He had a very strong parent, but he was so depressed all the time because he would give in to peers and things, and so Batman was his hero. So great, let's read Batman comics. And so for the next probably 3 months, we read tons of Batman comics together. And we identified what are the things about Batman that you like? Why do you like Batman? And he was able to identify things, and we talked about ways that he could act like Batman in certain circumstances and situations. And after about 3 months, he had really built up a pretty strong and a very rigid
Right.
sense of, he had the right and wrong, but a very rigid courage. And so it was really neat to watch. And then we identified a couple of other heroes that he eventually was able to mimic and then internalize and externalize. And by the time we were done, I think we had identified a total of 5 characters, Batman being the primary, but 4 others. And he was able to kind of bring those together to create his own personal internal hero. It was just really neat to watch him gain this courage, and then of course we needed to go through the peer stage because he also had a very weak peer. He had no flexibility, but through that period of the hero stage development that I did with him, that was probably about a 6-month period. He went from being kind of a, he was going from job to job. He wasn't able to settle down really well and really, and he was out late at night with his friends and playing video games a lot, not being real responsible. By the end of those 6 months, though, he'd actually left most of those friends. He had one of those friends that was in a band in their church, a church band. And so he ended up joining the band, and he and that friend became really close. They became actively engaged in their church, and the other friends kind of trickled out because they just didn't fit
Right.
with his internal parent. And now he had the courage to say, you know what, I like you guys, but you're not doing the things I need to do. He got himself a full-time steady job. It was really quite neat to watch. So don't ever think it's too late. If your internal hero is weak and you find yourself caving in and oftentimes feeling depressed and low self-worth, oftentimes those are symptoms of a weak internal hero. That is something that you can develop even now.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So do we have an assignment? Sarah, do you have an assignment for people with an internal about the internal hero?
One assignment that you gave to Louie and me was for us to figure out each other's heroes without talking to each other. And I thought that was such a neat assignment because it really, and we guessed right. We guessed right at each other's heroes, or got like within the ballpark. Right. And that was just so neat to see how we actually did still have those characteristics that we sought after as kids.
Yeah.
So I think if you're married, have your spouse, and for your spouse, try to figure out what your spouse's hero is.
If you're married, do that. If you're not married, find a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And try to identify, who their childhood heroes might have been, and then ask them and see how close you come. A secondary assignment is, if you have children or you interact with children, pay attention and try to figure out who they're trying to mimic and internalize, and see if you can find ways to be positive about their internal hero. Or if they're an older child and they're exhibiting different behavioral patterns, skills that they're trying to develop, try to be positive. Find ways to be positive and to remove the criticism from your interaction with those children. All right, thank you.